Nuclear war has been a huge threat. I have a bet going with my friends on how the world's going to end, and I chose nuclear war. According to Catherine Kelleher in Getting to Zero, the U.S. has over 4,000 nukes. That's enough to kill everyone on the planet over a dozen times. The U.S. and Russia combined have over 90% of the world's nukes, and that number used to be 100%. So with that in mind, you can see why nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia would be so devastating. And that was the whole reason for the Cold War, basically. One of the most important and the closest times to nuclear war during the Cold War was the missile crisis. The Cold War started almost immediately after World War II ended. In 1949, the Soviets set off their own atomic bomb, which was kind of shocking to everyone because they had caught up so quickly. Now, to avoid direct conflict between the two powers, they would often use other countries as sort of a proxy war, and the U.S. would do anything to prevent the spread of communism. That's why it was so concerning to Kennedy and the United States when Castro won the Cuban Revolution and turned Cuba communist. It's only 100 miles off the coast of Florida, and the U.S. oil companies pretty much controlled the country. Castro quickly nationalized those companies and didn't compensate the U.S. at all. So in response, we set an embargo on Cuba that's still in effect today. It started out with just weapons, but it spread over pretty much any imports at all. So because of this, and because of how poor Cuba is, Castro turned to the USSR for aid, which they were happy to provide. At first it was just sugar for Russian fuel, but Khrushchev, the Russian leader, saw a much bigger opportunity. One of the United States' most powerful advantages during the Cold War was that they had nuclear bombs set up in Europe. The idea being that if you launched a nuke from closer to Russia, you'd get there sooner, of course, and the missile defense systems would have much less time to intercept them. To even the footing, Khrushchev wanted to have his own Turkey, Turkey being the closest destination to Russia where we had nukes. In 1962, and this picture is kind of hard to see, but you can kind of see like this missile down here, and there's like some silos being built up here. It's basically just the construction of a missile site in Cuba, with the nukes already on site. In response to this, Kennedy addressed the nation. He said, "A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment being shipped to Cuba will be initiated. Any ships carrying such cargo will be turned back." He set up a naval blockade around Cuba entirely, and 13 Russian ships were turned back at the blockade. And the fact that they had missiles in Cuba was so concerning is because, according to Marta Schaef and her 2009 book, The Cuban Missile Crisis, these nukes would have a range of over 2,000 miles and be able to hit basically any U.S. city. Now, the 2 points during the crisis where the U.S. was closest to nuclear war was when depth charges were used on a Russian sub, and when Khrushchev was begged by Castro to preemptively strike the U.S. because Castro thought they were going to be invaded. Now, the Russian sub that the depth charges were used on had protocol that if the hull was breached, they were supposed to fire their nukes. But all 3 officers had to agree, and one of them disagreed. So that officer basically was personally responsible for stopping a nuclear launch. And after 2 weeks of intense negotiations, they came to a deal ending the crisis. That's just a picture of Kennedy's speech and then 2 of the ships that are involved in the blockade. So in the aftermath, it was seen as kind of humiliating for the Russians, the deal that was made, and Khrushchev eventually lost power, even though tensions were eased. But basically, the deal that went down was the Russians removed their missiles from Cuba, and in exchange, the U.S. promised to never invade Cuba, and they secretly promised to remove their nukes from Turkey. Now, all in all, we were basically just pretty lucky to avoid a nuclear disaster here. It was, a big victory for Kennedy to be able to get the nukes out of Cuba. Hugh Phillips, in the Encyclopedia of Russian History, states that it was the first time that our alert system was placed on DEFCON 2, alert going from 5 being least serious to DEFCON 1 being the most serious. And there's never been a DEFCON 1 alert. That basically means we're about to be nuked. The missile crisis and nuclear war is still relevant today because the threat of nuclear war is still relevant today. In the past, it was kind of concerning about if we would nuke Russia or if Russia would nuke us. And now the concern is more about between us and North Korea. And you should probably be at least a little bit concerned about the two leaders that control the nuclear weapons in these two countries. In conclusion, I hope you learned a little bit about one of the most important events in U.S. history and in the Cold War, especially because if it had gone down differently and if the nuclear war had actually happened, none of us might be here today.